Memory is tricky. I mean, when I look at my past, do I actually look it through the lens of memory? Do I look it through the lens of my daydreams, my imagination, my wishful thinking? Do I look it through the lens of resentment, regret? Do I look it through the lens of the videos I recorded or the works I've written? How do we keep the past alive? And how does our memory help or hinder us? And how did the modern world transform the ways in which we use our memory and the past to construct our identities? This video was inspired by Maria Stepanova's book, In Memory of Memory, which is a beautiful meditation on memory, history, family, and I'm just going to try to condense some of the things she said and add my own thoughts on this. I think we can't talk about memory, especially modern memory, without talking about our relationship to the past. And what is really interesting is how Stepanova describes the past as something we colonize or use to generate profit. Unlike nature, past lives are endlessly submissive, allowing us to do whatever we may decide to do with them. Culture treats the past as a state treats as mineral wealth, mining it for all it's worth. This parasitical relationship with the dead is a profitable industry. And this certainly tells us something about our priorities. It is obviously very difficult to escape the capitalist framework we're all in, where everything is to be monetized, utilized so that it's never wasted, as if nothing had any inherent value whatsoever, just for itself, by itself. And because the past cannot speak for itself, at least not directly, it's very easy to extract what we need from it for our own advantage, whether it's history at large or our own past. And I think this also corresponds to how we treat the dead, who also belong to the past. After all, how we treat the dead says a lot about how we treat ourselves. If we want to remember them, it's because we ourselves want to be remembered. If we create stories about them, we idolize the past and set it in stone through our own lens to create an illusion of control and beauty faced with an uncertain future. And also, who we remember also shows who we choose to be representatives of the world. And usually, we do not choose ordinary people as representatives. We choose celebrities, public figures, sensationalists, politicians. And that may be because we seem to value the public, the seen, the performative, more than what remains unseen or unsaid. On the surface, I guess it's in a way natural, but I think it's a shame because we don't speak enough of those who are unassuming, quiet, ordinary, either dead or alive. And I think it's one of the reasons why Stepanova's book is so great, because she talks about her family, who is ordinary on the surface. She talks about lives that were quiet, unassuming, and she gives a lot of meaning to them. And she even compares the dead to minorities at some point. What unites all the minorities puts them in the same boat as other people's sense that their subjectivity is incomplete. And then she goes on to list minorities until she describes the dead. The dead for whom nothing matters anymore. Even if you aren't in any of the former categories, you are certain to be in the last. And I think there is definitely a connection here in that we often treat the dead as somehow incomplete, in the same way as we treat certain groups as also incomplete in some way. As she later says, there are people who exist on the earth not as objects in themselves, but as extraneous specks or tiny spots on objects. And those specks may even bring about the image of graves, but then again it could also remind us of crowds, blurry figures all blending into one. But I think when we segregate the past and the dead like that, some deserve to be spoken about while others are nothing but tiny spots, then we do the same to the living. But of course, it's impossible to remember everyone or tell everyone's stories. Someone will always get left behind. And that goes for both past and present, both dead and the living. But instead of making sure every person is given enough attention, which is impossible, we can at least try to maintain a balance. A balance of public and private, silence and noise, grandness and intimacy, success and struggle. What's also significant here is not just what we remember, but how and why we choose to remember it. And Stepanova keeps coming back to this topic of our attempts at self-immortalization in the modern world. especially with regard to social media. And as she says at one point, and I'm sorry, there will be a lot of quotes, just because I love them so much. With every new selfie we take, every group shot or passport photo, our lives become arranged into a chain of images, a history that is quite different from the one we tell ourselves and want others to believe. Balzac foresaw some of this and refused to have his photograph taken, reflecting that each new picture removed a layer of Balzac, pared it away, and if you let it happen, soon nothing would be left of you. And I really like this idea that creating chains of continuous images instead of preserving us is actually what takes us farther away from ourselves. Because it's one thing to just take photos, but it's quite another to create ourselves through these images. It's as if without the image taken, the experience is incomplete, which corresponds to the earlier point about incomplete subjectivities of the dead or the minorities, as if our lives are fuller if we have the chains of images to show for them. But if image replaces life, then there are no connections or movements between them. And in a recent video, I discussed the importance of connections. Even if we cannot understand the world or ourselves, the least we can do is see these connections. Instead, there are just these static images. And we may make something out of them, but even if you complete a puzzle and put all the static puzzle pieces together, it's still nothing but a puzzle. And this keeping track of everything is obviously linked to our desire to immortalize ourselves. But Stepanova points out that while we may think we're free to do this, we're actually forced to do it, as if this was in fact not a privilege but an imprisonment. And she writes, "This immortality is terrifying, but even more terrifying is the fact that it is imposed on you. In the past, immortality was a matter of choice, though you could reject it and choose what everyone was offered as a matter of course. And now, we have accepted the impossibility of simply disappearing. Whether you want it or not, you are facing the strange extension of your existence, your outward form preserved for all time. All what disappears is what made you yourself. It is a luxury permitted to very few to vanish entirely, to disappear from the radar. And nowadays, nothing ever truly disappears, or at least we have no control over it. As much as people nowadays want to be famous or remembered or recognized, this can very often turn against us. And we keep seeing this in a public discourse over and over again, especially recently. And with our whole identities, public identities, being stored in computers all over the world, we have no idea what may be there that we might not know about. So somehow being known or remembered or immortalized in this way feels almost like a threat or a curse. At the same time, we can never fully escape our materiality and therefore our anonymity. As Stepanova writes, the physical body carries no caption with its name and description. It has no distinguishing features. So we can take many pictures and filter them the way we want. We want to do the best we can to be remembered as unique and beautiful and extraordinary, but at the end of the day, our bodies always anonymize us, which I think is a good way to stay humble, to try to stay humble within our embodiment. And on this channel, I talked a lot about this duality of being both singular and unique and important, but also tiny and insignificant. And I think it is hard for us in the modern world to accept that. And I don't mean the insignificance, but this seeming contradiction, this duality. And yet, we keep trying to use this point in history, this opportunity for immortalization, to create our narratives, stories, histories, identities. For example, Stepanova compares portraits to photos or selfies. In the past, you were known by your single portrait. It had to capture everything. It encapsulated everything about you, the single portrait. And nowadays, we can take as many photos as we want. We can take a picture at any second, which means the modern self is focused on change and fragmentation. And even if we do believe in an essence of a self, it is, by modern design, fragmented. And this isn't inherently bad, but I think it can be really exhausting to always feel the need to capture oneself, yesterday's self, today's self, tomorrow's self, to always keep it updated or, worse, optimized. And of course, all of this is very much linked to the fact that we're always watched, and we know it. As Stepanova writes, the dictatorship of the viewer or watcher with its unfounded demands on the image is an unjust one. The word watcher in Russian has a second, less obvious meaning. In the language of prisons, camps, and the criminal underworld, the Watcher is the one who sets the rules and makes sure the others follow them. And the issue here is that the longer we put our updated or optimized selves on display, the more enslaved we become to the Watcher or the sheer idea of a Watcher. And I guess this is a bit of a digression from memory to identity, but those are always linked. And I think the way we construct and display ourselves is also how we remember ourselves and, of course, our lives. The essence of our lives. It may control how the essence of our lives changes, how the fabric of our life changes for us. And of course, our memory is never perfect, but I think that if there's a big enough gap between the outward memory, the one we display, and the inward intuitive memory, the one we live through, then we become even more fragmented, and not necessarily in a good way. In a way, reading Stepanova's work is indicative of memory itself. At first, we want to note everything down. We want to remember and understand every reference. Sebald, Mandelstam, Susan Sontag, and many, many more, including the many names of Stepanova's family members. But then when we get another name drop, another quote, another photograph, another insightful thought, we just shrug our shoulders and say, you know what? I'm just going to sit back and enjoy this without pressure to remember everything or capture everything. And maybe we could learn to do this with life itself, too. This was another video from the International Booker Prize series where I read the shortlist and take some of the ideas I liked and use them to discuss the topics I usually discuss in this channel. And I must say I really enjoyed doing the series. There's still one video left, should be two, but I'll talk about that later. And I hope you're enjoying the series. And as always, thank you for watching. If you liked the video, consider liking it. If you want to stick around for longer, consider subscribing. And I'll see you in another video. Because I hate video endings. I never know what to say. But this is not an ending. We'll see each other next week, hopefully. So yeah.